え、奴の最終的な目的って何なのかな。やっこさん一人で戦争でも始めようってのか。
戦争だって？そんなものはとっくに始まってるさ。問題なのはいかにけりをつけるか、それだけだ。後藤さん、警察官として自衛官として俺たちが守ろうとしてるものってのは何なんだろうな。前の戦争から半世紀、俺もあんたも生まれてこの方、戦争なんてものは経験せずに生きてきた。平和、俺たちが守るべき平和。だがこの国のこの町の平和とは一体何だ？かつての総力戦とその敗北、米軍の占領政策、ついこの間まで続いていた核抑止による冷戦とその代理戦争、そして今も世界の大半で繰り返されている内戦、民族衝突、武力紛争、そういった無数の戦争によって合成され支えられてきた血まみれの経済的繁栄、それが俺たちの平和の中身だ。戦争への恐怖に基づくなりふり構わぬ平和、正当な対価をよその国の戦争で支払い、そのことから目をそらし続ける不正義の平和。
そんなきな臭い平和でもそれを守るのが俺たちの仕事さ。不正義の平和だろうと正義の戦争よりよほどマシだ。
あんたが正義の戦争を嫌うのはよくわかるよ。かつてそれを口にした連中にろくなやつはいなかったし、その口車に乗ってひどい目に遭った人間のリストで歴史の図書館はいっぱいだからな。だがあんたは知ってるはずだ。正義の戦争と不正義の平和の差はそう明瞭なものじゃない。平和という言葉が嘘つきたちの正義になってから、俺たちは俺たちの平和を信じることができずにいるんだ。戦争が平和を生むように、平和もまた戦争を生む。単に戦争でないというだけの消極的で空疎な平和はいずれ実体としての戦争によって埋め合わされる。そう思ったことはないか？その成果だけはしっかり受け取っていながら、モニターの向こうに戦争を押し込め、ここが戦線の単なる後方に過ぎないことを忘れる。いや、忘れたふりをし続ける。そんな欺瞞を続けていれば、いずれは大きな罰が下されると。
罰？誰が下すんだ？神様か？
この町では誰もが神様みたいなもんさ。いながらにしてその目で見、その手で触れることのできぬあらゆる現実を知る。何一つしない神様だ。神がやらなきゃ人がやる。いずれわかるさ。俺たちが奴に追いつけなければな。
The preceding was a scene from Patlabor 2, one of the more memorable and well-known scenes from the movie. A conversation between two characters, Goto and Arakawa, where the latter attempts to explain the motives of the villain to the former, while criticizing the state of the first world at the same time. I don't believe in summarizing things. To understand something, I think it has to be experienced in its entirety, which is why I decided to play the scene in full at the beginning of this video. This scene especially is a great example of why I don't believe in summarizing, and, well, I'll try to break it down to explain exactly why. What the characters are talking about and what they're saying is only part of what makes the scene. It's a grounded and sensible yet slightly provoking explanation of why peace isn't necessarily an absolute good, nor is peace the opposite of war. Rather, the two are intrinsically linked. The conveniences and luxuries we enjoy in the first world are only possible due to other countries, far away from ourselves, being exploited. This doesn't only extend to proxy wars to stimulate the economy, but also the creation and maintenance of a puppet states and banana republics and exporting slave labor and such. It's a very broad subject and can be interpreted in a multitude of ways, so I won't get too into it. The main point that I managed to derive from the scene is the implication that peace is only possible while the population can be kept docile through a healthy economy, which can only be achieved through war. Without war and without somewhere to steal resources from, there won't be enough to go around, and the country's population will not be kept in control. It's hardly a new or controversial theory to suggest that in most first world countries, people have become so reliant upon their luxuries and conveniences that a revolution that will almost certainly take those conveniences away is unthinkable to most people, regardless of how much they insist they aren't dependent on them. Like Arakawa says, people have gained power equal to that of gods, yet they can't be bothered to do anything with it, because doing so would mean parting with that power. It takes a man who is free from the chains of first world convenience to truly change something.
神がやらなきゃ人がやる.
The word he uses, hito, although the subtitles say people, can also be translated to mankind or simply man, the opposite of gods. As for the word gods, it's kami, which is also used to mean things such as spirits or entities beyond man. Kami are more like a whole race rather than the single entity God has become in Western cultures. That's God with a capital G. In Japanese mythology, man and gods are separate, split into the world of the mundane and the world of the divine, though the borders between the two are vague and one can cross over without even being aware of it. The track used in the background is called Unnatural City, composed by Kenji Kawai. It's what most people will probably notice about this scene and remember from it. Its heavily reverbed synth, looping samples, and low choir gives off the sensation of being in a dream. While Patlabor is a science fiction setting focusing on a modern metropolis, this track would feel more at home in a story about spirits in the Japanese countryside 600 years ago. The track almost gives off the feeling that the city sits on the very border between the mundane and the unreal, and this boat ride is the two of them crossing the border into the spiritual realm. Scattered throughout the song are also what I can only describe as sound samples of rusty industrial noise. It's like the city itself is alive, and these sounds are it screaming out into the abyss. Having the music show spirituality despite the story being sci-fi gives off a sense of a parachronism that is something being outside of its own time. The director, Mamoru Oshii, would later do the same in a much more famous sequence from Ghost in the Shell, where a song in the style of old Japanese folk song sung by a children's choir is played in a hybrid technological sequence. If Ghost in the Shell was a more typical American science fiction movie, it's not hard to imagine the track in this scene instead being a standard techno song with bassy synth and electronic drum going oonce, 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 oonce. As for Patlabor 2, if it instead were a standard American thriller, the song for the boat scene would likely be some kind of strings to keep you on edge, or perhaps just silence. While Lego music can be an interesting artistic choice in its own right, were you to strip this scene of its backing track, I think something really essential to the scene's essence would be lost. The music is what makes the scene feel like a combination of the mundane and the divine, mixing technology and politics with spirituality. Western stories often keep technology and spirituality separate. Even if there are mentions of religion, it's usually more so on the surface level, in the way that the characters practice the religion. In my own personal opinion, much of the greatest science fiction mixes technology with spirituality, but rather than doing it in an overt way, the spirituality should be implied, so that the one experiencing the story is the one almost practicing the religion, without being fully aware of it. Spirituality should not be explained or shown, but always felt, as if you're in the middle of a ritual. Especially in Patlabor, is the spirituality only ever implied. One might argue it's not even there at all, and the mention of God should only be taken as pure allegory. To me, though, the implications of divinity are overt enough to where I can't just dismiss it as some elaborate metaphor only meant to explain socio-political bemoanings. While it is partially that, I also heavily feel that it must, to some degree, be meant literally. The conversation between Goto and Arakawa doesn't really feel like a conversation or debate between two people. Rather, it almost comes off as a debate someone is having with themselves inside their own head. The voices are soft-spoken and are outputted directly, making it come off as non-diegetic, even though the immediate scene beforehand has manipulated the dialogue audio to make it sound like it's being spoken in the environment they're in.
ねえ、奴の最終的な目的って何なのかな。やっこさん一人で戦争でも始めようってのか。
戦争だって？後藤さん、警察官として自衛官として俺たちが守ろうとしてるものってのは何なんだろうな。
Arakawa is almost exclusively the only one talking, with Goto only chiming in once in a while to make some small comment on what Arakawa is saying. Although they're on a boat together having a conversation, Arakawa isn't even shown in a single frame for the whole sequence. Instead, only Goto is shown, while a majority of the shots focus on low-perspective views of the city. The scene's purpose within the greater story is to develop Akara somewhat as a character. You go one layer deeper, and its purpose is to lay out some of the themes of the movie and what it's trying to say. Another layer down, and the scene is what I believe to be the writer talking to you, Goto, as your stand-in. Using characters as mouthpieces while taught about political issues is nothing new or even typically admirable. But to me, this scene does so in a fascinating manner. Arakawa is nowhere to be seen because it's not necessarily Arakawa talking, but the writer, whether that be Kazunori Ito or Mamoru Oshii or whomever. That's not to say I believe that what Arakawa is saying are the exact views of the writer, but rather than it's as if the writer is taking you aside for a minute to try and plant some ideas in your head, to try and get you to think about something. Only Arakawa talks for most of it, with Goto sometimes chiming in, but only ever to give the obvious retorts to something Arakawa says. The low-angle shots of the city, the shots that don't show Goto, give off the impression that they are from Goto's point of view, sliding from one side to the other along with the boat's movement. You, the viewer, take on the role of Goto in this conversation. You are seeing what he's seeing, and hearing what he's hearing, and the way the responses are written, likely thinking what he's thinking too. The colors used for the backgrounds are very low saturation, very muddied. The clouds in the skies are thick with undefined shapes, the water is faint, misty, and murky. It's in stark contrast to the industrial structures of the city, which have hard, angular shapes. The colors and shape usage here can give off the feeling of drowning, with the tall, imposing structures crushing you beneath their immense weight and size, accentuated by the low-angle views. The way the city is drawn makes it feel as if it's infinite, made to get lost in, much in the way one can get lost in the world of spirits. Rather than the city merely being inhabited by gods, it feels like the city itself is a god. Unapproachable, intimidating, stretching on infinitely, and absolutely incomprehensible in its architecture and scope. The English dub of this scene is odd. While far from the most egregious translation of anime, it comes off as if the translator was trying a little too hard to be smart and put his own spin on the monologue. While the original speech is actually very black and white about there being no such thing as a just war, in the English dub they add the unnecessary asterisk of claiming, except the war against the Nazis, the one arguably just war, as a sort of gotcha.
It may be an immoral peace, maybe an unjust peace, but an unjust peace is still better than a just war.
I share your revulsion about just wars. If there ever was such a thing, it was the war against the Nazis. Our allies, Goto, our allies. But how many millions throughout history have died in the cause of what their lying leaders called just wars?
And a weak way to propose additional grey morality by bringing up that if the Second World War was just, the Japanese were on the unjust side. Regardless of how you feel about that statement, it strikes me as insulting to the original message that anyone telling you that a war is just, or was just, is trying to sell you something. Although the translator may disagree, to Arakawa and Goto, a just war is an oxymoron. Something used by despots and the corrupt to goad the common man into dying for nothing. Okay, listen, like I said at the beginning, trying to summarize something is impossible, and while I'm analyzing this scene, I'm doing it in a vacuum, while in reality it's part of a larger movie, and only really makes sense as one part of something greater. The purpose of this video was two things, neither of which was trying to explain to you why this scene is great. Watching it by itself should have been enough to tell you why it's great. It's like Lynchy says, you can't necessarily talk about movies, the movie is the talking. Rather, one part of why I made this video was to explain to myself why I like this scene, write some things down and help me comprehend it better. The other point to this is to sort of prove something either to myself or someone else. I'm usually very uninterested in anime analysis on YouTube that only discusses the surface level aspects, basically just explaining the story, what happens and stuff. but the plot is such a tiny part of what makes something like this, and ignoring what the art, music, and subtext does for the experience helps no one. I'm obviously no expert either, that much should be clear to anyone, but art is so much more than the surface level, and it kills me to always have the surface level focused on. Anyway, I hope this wasn't too pretentious. Also, don't bother checking my channel because none of my other videos are like this. Thank you for your time.